If anyone had told me a year ago that my life in Charleston, South Carolina would collapse overnight, I would have laughed it off, maybe even rolled my eyes. I used to think my family's fortune could protect me from anything the world might throw at me. My mother, Vivian Harcourt, wasn't just a powerful woman. She was practically royalty. Her name spoken in awe across boardrooms and charity balls from Miami to Paris. She owned sprawling estates in New York, Boston, and London, places that felt less like real homes and more like shimmering jewels on a velvet crown. $17 billion, that was the number always attached to her in magazine features and whispered in late-night parties. But to me, she was simply my mother. Warm, enigmatic, always moving, always planning the next step. I never realized how fragile it all was, how quickly the ground could open beneath your feet. Harcourt Hall stood like a sentinel above the low country marshes, its columns white as bone, its windows gleaming gold in the Carolina sun. My childhood was painted in broad, bright strokes, afternoons spent racing horses with my mother on the private trail, the scent of honeysuckle and salt water filling the air. Evenings cloaked in laughter as we entertained senators, CEOs, and old friends from Europe in our candle-lit dining room. There was always music, always a sense of security, as if nothing could ever touch us. I had tutors who taught me everything from French literature to the intricacies of investment banking. I attended boarding schools in Massachusetts and summered in the English countryside. Our world was one of privilege, but also of tradition and a quiet, unspoken loneliness. My father, Charles Harcourt, was distant even then, an imposing figure with cold blue eyes, forever preoccupied with ledgers, mergers, and the endless tide of correspondence that flowed through his office. Everything changed the night my mother died. They told me it was a heart attack, but that simple explanation never felt right. She had always been in perfect health, walking the gardens each morning, never missing a day of riding. Yet, I remember the hush that fell over the house, the way the staff's eyes wouldn't meet mine, and the way my father began to walk with an even stiffer gait, as if the entire mansion had grown heavier around him. I was numb at the funeral. The pews were filled with people in black, a sea of somber faces, politicians, socialites, distant cousins I barely recognized. The press camped at the gates, hungry for headlines, while the scent of lilac filled every room until it was hard to breathe. My father barely spoke to me, only appearing for brief, formal moments before disappearing into his study with the lawyers, the accounts, and whatever secrets he refused to share. In the days and weeks that followed, the house felt colder. The familiar rooms now echoed with emptiness. Staff left quietly, some replaced by strangers in crisp uniforms with unfamiliar accents. My world grew smaller, the boundaries of my life shrinking to my bedroom and the fading photographs of happier times. I felt adrift, caught between childhood and the dark uncertainty of adulthood, missing my mother more with each passing day. Then, as if the universe hadn't yet finished with me, my father made an announcement that stunned even the most seasoned of Charleston's gossips. Barely a month after my mother's burial, he married again. Isabel. Her name was spoken with a kind of awe and suspicion at garden parties all over town. She was young, perhaps only a few years older than me, and impossibly beautiful, with a cloud of golden hair and a laugh that sparkled like champagne. Isabel came from London, with a pedigree that suited my father's taste for all things refined and European. But there was something cold about her smile, something almost predatory in the way she glided through the halls as if she already owned them. The wedding itself was a spectacle, white roses flown in from Paris, crystal chandeliers glittering above the ballroom, a jazz quartet playing beneath the grand staircase. I stood awkwardly at the edge of the festivities, watching my father twirl his new bride across the polished floor, my heart pounding with a sense of dread I couldn't name. The guests clapped and raised their glasses, toasting to new beginnings and fresh chapters, while I felt the world tilting beneath me. Then came the moment I can never forget. My father called for silence, his arm wrapped possessively around Isabel's waist, and turned to face the crowd. His smile was thin, almost cruel. "From today onward," he declared, his voice ringing through the ballroom, "I have no daughter." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. I felt every eye turn to me, some wide with shock, others narrowed in curiosity, a few gleaming with satisfaction. My breath caught in my throat. He stepped forward and handed me a small, faded envelope. My name Amelia was written on the front in my mother's delicate, looping script. The sight of her handwriting nearly undid me. My father's eyes were as cold as the Atlantic in winter. "You are no longer welcome here," he said quietly, his words as sharp as any slap. Isabel watched me with a look I will never forget, triumphant and utterly merciless. I wanted to scream, to beg, to plead for the world to right itself. But I couldn't. My body moved of its own accord as I turned, pushing past the whispering crowd, my head bowed to hide the tears streaming down my cheeks. No one stopped me. The staff I'd known since childhood looked away. The heavy front doors closed behind me, shutting out the only life I'd ever known. I stood on the marble steps in the soft drizzle of a Charleston night, clutching the envelope and my mother's memory, feeling more alone than I ever thought possible. In that moment, with the lights of Harcourt Hall blazing behind me and the city's darkness swallowing me whole, I realized I had nothing left, not money, not family, not even a place to call home. The world had stripped me bare, and all I had left was the faint hope that somewhere my mother's love still lingered, if only in the curve of her handwriting or the whispered advice she'd given me long ago, before the storm had come and swept everything away. The city was unrecognizable that night, washed in a blur of rain and distant traffic. I had walked out of the only home I had ever known with nothing but a thin dress clinging to my skin, soaked through in minutes, and the envelope from my mother held tightly in my hand. Every familiar street felt strange and cold. The grandeur of Charleston's historic district, once comforting, with its gas lamps and old brick facades, now seemed to sneer at me, reminding me of all I had lost. I tried my phone, but the screen flashed account locked, and my number disconnected. My cards were declined everywhere I tried them, first at the 24-hour diner near the Battery, then at the little corner store I'd visited since I was a child. My name had vanished, erased by someone who knew exactly how to make a person disappear. I walked for hours, feet aching, until I found myself on the outskirts of the city where the historic charm gave way to blinking neon and the smell of old oil and fried food. There, tucked between a pawn shop and a closed-down liquor store, I found the Palmetto Motel. The sign flickered in the rain. The O-Inn Motel burned out, casting a ghostly blue glow on the cracked parking lot. I hesitated, shivering, before stepping inside. The lobby was small and smelled of bleach. The night clerk didn't ask questions when I handed over the few bills I had managed to keep from the wedding, just enough for one night, in a room that hadn't seen luxury in decades. The key was heavy, attached to a cracked plastic fob. I thanked him and climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, every step echoing through the empty hallway. My room was tiny and cold, with stained curtains and a battered dresser pushed against the wall. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, buzzing softly. I locked the door, bolted it for good measure, and collapsed onto the hard mattress. For a while, I just lay there, listening to the rain drum against the window, feeling the ache in my chest settle into something deeper and heavier. Eventually, I remembered the envelope. My hands were numb as I slid my finger under the seal, unfolding it with trembling care. There was a letter in my mother's handwriting, elegant, looping, familiar in a way that made my heart twist. But what fell out next was stranger still. A battered playing card, the Queen of Hearts, and a tiny golden key taped to the back. I stared at it, confused at first, until a memory surfaced: my mother, sitting on the edge of my childhood bed, her voice low and serious. "If anything ever happens to me, and you have nothing left, remember, the key to your future is hidden with the past." At the time, I thought it was just another one of her cryptic stories, the sort she used to tell me when I couldn't sleep. But now her words echoed in my mind, sharper than ever. My eyes filled with tears. The weight of her absence settled over me, but beneath it was something else, a tiny spark of hope, or maybe defiance. My mother hadn't abandoned me. She'd left a clue. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's cold face, Isabel's triumphant smile, and the endless, silent halls of Harcourt Hall. The storm outside rattled the windows, and every shadow seemed to move. More than once, I thought I heard my mother's voice, soft and reassuring, as if she were sitting beside me, stroking my hair the way she used to when I was a child. I wanted to believe she was watching over me, guiding me even now. By dawn, my mind was made up. I had to return to Harcourt Hall, no matter the risk. I waited until the rain eased, pulling on the only coat I had, a faded Burberry trench my mother had given me years before. I tucked the Queen of Hearts and the golden key into my pocket, then slipped out of the motel before the clerk could ask any questions. Charleston was quiet at sunrise. I walked the long road back to the house, avoiding the main streets, keeping to the shadows. The city I'd always loved felt different now, emptier, lonelier. The grandeur of the old houses seemed hollow, their porches and gardens hiding secrets of their own. When I finally reached the familiar iron gates of Harcourt Hall, my heart thudded in my chest. I half expected them to be locked, but to my relief, the old code still worked. I slipped inside, moving quickly past the manicured lawns and the fountain where I'd played as a child. I knew I couldn't risk being seen. Instead of using the front door, I crept around to the servants' entrance, a narrow, weathered door hidden by ivy at the side of the house. It stuck a little, as if it hadn't been used in years, but I managed to squeeze through. The house was silent. I paused in the corridor, listening for voices, footsteps, anything. But the only sound was the distant ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. I made my way up the back staircase, avoiding the creaky boards I'd learned to sidestep as a girl. The hallways were dark, lit only by thin shafts of morning light. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper of wind a ghost from the past. I thought of my mother, her perfume, the sound of her laughter echoing in the sunlit rooms, and the ache in my chest grew sharper. At last, I reached my mother's study. The door was locked, but the tiny key from the Queen of Hearts fit perfectly. Inside, the room was just as she'd left it, her favorite books on the shelves, her reading lamp still angled just so. I moved quickly, crossing to the wall where her favorite portrait hung, a painting of her as a young woman, dressed in blue, her eyes full of secrets. I pressed my fingers along the edge of the frame until I found the catch. With a soft click, the painting swung forward, revealing a small safe built into the wall. My hands shook as I slid the golden key into the lock. It turned smoothly. Inside was a single envelope, thick and heavy. My name was written on it in my mother's hand. I sat down at her old desk and opened it. The first thing I saw was her will, signed and sealed. And beneath that, page after page of legal documents, all naming me, Amelia Harcourt, as the sole heir to everything my mother owned. In that moment, the ghosts faded, and something fierce and unbreakable rose in me. My mother had outsmarted them all. The fight was not over. It was only just beginning. The envelope in my hands felt heavier than gold. As I left my mother's study, my fingers smudged with dust and nerves. My heart was pounding with a cocktail of fear and determination, emotions that, until that moment, I'd rarely tasted in such raw form. The secret she'd left me was more than a lifeline. It was a weapon, and now I was the only one who could wield it. I hurried down the back stairs, careful to keep to the shadows. The house was beginning to stir. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the new house staff preparing for another celebration. Laughter, Isabel's, bright and brittle, floated up from the ballroom. That sound hardened my resolve. I paused in the kitchen, my favorite room as a child. I remembered sneaking cookies from the blue and white jar while my mother worked at the table, planning galas and writing notes to distant cousins in London. The familiar scent of coffee and lemon polish filled my senses, anchoring me. I reached for the landline phone on the wall, one of the few things Charles hadn't changed yet, and dialed Edward Prescott's number from memory. He answered on the second ring, his deep, measured voice both comforting and intimidating. "Prescott." I barely managed to steady my breath. "Edward, it's Amelia. I found something. It's my mother's will." There was a silence on the other end, so complete, I thought the line had gone dead. Then, quietly, as if I were a frightened child again, he said, "I know, Amelia. I wrote that will. Your mother insisted it remain a secret, in case Charles ever tried anything." I heard him moving quickly on the other end, papers shuffling. "I'm coming to you right now. Don't let anyone see you. Stay in the kitchen." His calm certainty was a balm to my frayed nerves. I waited, pacing, reading and rereading the first lines of my mother's letter. There was no ambiguity. Every house, every account, every share in every company, all of it was in my name. Tears blurred my vision as I realized the magnitude of what my mother had done to protect me. I could almost hear her voice in the clatter of silverware or the way the light danced across the marble countertops. "Be brave, darling," she'd always said. Bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's standing up when you're most afraid. It felt like a lifetime had passed before Edward arrived, his black sedan pulling into the staff driveway. He swept into the kitchen with the efficiency of a man used to high stakes. His gray hair was mussed, and his overcoat dripped rain onto the tiles. But his eyes, sharp, blue, and unyielding, softened when they met mine. "Let me see," he said, and I handed him the will, the legal documents, every slip of paper my mother had tucked into that safe. He flipped through them with the practiced speed of someone who'd spent decades untangling the knots of old money. At the end, he looked up at me and nodded, satisfaction on his face. "It's airtight, Amelia. Your mother left nothing to chance." A sense of justice, long dormant in me, stirred. "What do we do?" He smiled, grim and a little proud. "We take back what's yours." We left the kitchen together and moved toward the ballroom, the place where all of this had begun to unravel. My nerves danced in my stomach, but Edward's presence beside me was a pillar. I could hear laughter, clinking glasses, the familiar swell of a jazz band playing "Fly Me to the Moon," my mother's favorite song, and now a bitter reminder of who was missing. I squared my shoulders and stepped into the light. The ballroom was packed. Charles and Isabel stood at the center, surrounded by guests dressed in silk and cashmere, their faces flushed with champagne and gossip. Charles was radiant, reveling in his new beginning, his arm looped around Isabel's tiny waist. For a moment I saw the man he'd once been, a distant, complicated figure who'd loved my mother in his own cold, brittle way. But any pity vanished as he noticed me. Conversations died mid-sentence as the crowd turned to watch me, the disinherited daughter who had returned, not in rags but with purpose burning in her eyes. Edward's voice, firm and commanding, carried across the marble floors. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." Charles stiffened. His face drained of color as he saw the envelope in my hands, the thick legal documents I clutched like a shield. Isabel tried to mask her discomfort, but her smile slipped. Her hand trembled where it held a crystal flute. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but strong as I read aloud the words my mother had written. Her final declaration echoing off the gilded ceilings. "All my properties, assets, and accounts in America and Europe I leave to my beloved daughter, Amelia Harcourt." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a second, no one moved. The world seemed to stop spinning. Charles found his voice first, his outrage barely masked by a thin veneer of charm. "This is ridiculous. That will was never meant to see the light of day." Edward cut him off, stepping between us. "It is legal. I witnessed it myself. Vivian's instructions were explicit and binding. Everything now belongs to Amelia. Legally, irrevocably." Isabel's tears came quickly, but I saw the calculation in her eyes. The crowd, unsure what to do, began to murmur, their excitement tinged with something close to fear. Charles, for the first time in my life, looked small, diminished not just by his loss, but by his cruelty revealed for all to see. The rest happened in a blur. Lawyers summoned, accounts frozen, papers signed and countersigned. Some guests slunk away, unwilling to witness a Harcourt fall from grace. Others remained, caught in the gravity of old money's rare public reckoning. Through it all, I stood tall, feeling my mother's presence as if she stood beside me, her arm around my shoulders. For the first time since her death, I was not afraid. The house that had cast me out now echoed with the sound of my voice, strong and clear. I watched my father fade from the room, his shoulders bowed, Isabel clinging to his arm. For a fleeting moment, a pang of pity threatened to crack my resolve. But then I remembered every cold glance, every cruel word the night he declared to the world he had no daughter. For a heartbeat, I almost forgave him. Almost, but justice at last was mine. The days that followed the reading of my mother's will were both a storm and a strange kind of calm. The quiet after the crash of thunder. Word spread quickly through Charleston's tight-knit, gossip-loving society that the great Charles Harcourt had been bested not by another business rival, but by his daughter. Some whispered it was poetic justice. Others watched me with cautious respect or outright suspicion, as if waiting for me to misstep. I didn't care. My focus narrowed to the task at hand, reclaiming what was rightfully mine and honoring my mother's memory. Charles predictably refused to go quietly. He hired a battalion of lawyers from Atlanta and New York, men and women in sharp suits who descended on Harcourt Hall with briefcases full of threats and bluster. I watched them swarm the old house, their voices bouncing off marble floors and wood-paneled walls, as if sheer force of argument could turn back time. But the law was clear. My mother's will had been crafted with precision and care, every loophole sewn shut by Edward Prescott's experienced hand. For every document Charles produced, Edward countered with the originals. For every accusation, he produced receipts, signatures, and sealed affidavits. I did not relish watching my father struggle, but I did not flinch either. He had made his choice, and the consequences unfolded with a cruel but perfect logic. Isabel, once the glittering center of every party, vanished almost overnight. Her dreams of luxury, my mother's jewelry, the horses, the estates in New York and London dissolved like mist. Charles grew smaller and grayer, retreating behind closed doors, his voice hoarse from shouting at lawyers and servants alike. At night, I could hear him pacing the halls, sometimes pausing outside my door. I never let him in. Within weeks, the transfers were complete. The deed to Harcourt Hall was once again in my name. The bank accounts, hundreds of millions in dollars and pounds, shifted with a simple signature. I fired the new staff Charles had brought in and rehired those loyal old faces who remembered my mother and had mourned with me. The house, once so cold and foreign, slowly became familiar again. I reopened wings that had been locked, filled the rooms with light and laughter, and the scent of fresh flowers. Where there had once been emptiness, I planted new life. But my father's presence remained a shadow haunting the corridors of Harcourt Hall, a living ghost of pride and ruin. One night, several weeks after his world had collapsed, he found me in the library. I was sitting at my mother's old writing desk, sorting through her correspondence, when I heard the door creak open. The library, with its towering shelves and heavy velvet drapes, had always been my sanctuary. It was there my mother had taught me to read, where she'd whispered stories in the firelight, where I'd always felt safest. Charles stood at the threshold, his frame stooped, his face drawn and hollow. The man who'd once filled every room with his presence now seemed to shrink in on himself. For a long moment, he said nothing. I waited, letting the silence settle between us like a stone. Finally, his voice broke the hush, ragged and thick with old pain. "Amelia, I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes."
He sank into the chair across from me, hands shaking.
"When your mother died, I thought I could start over. I thought marrying Isabel would fill the emptiness, but I see now what I've done. I let my greed destroy everything. Please, forgive me." For the first time in my life, I saw him clearly, not as the imposing figure of my childhood, but as a man stripped bare by his actions. Tears streamed down his face. He clutched at my hands, desperate. I remembered the night he disowned me, the way his words had cut through me as surely as a knife. I remembered the cold certainty in his eyes as he cast me out. My heart beat hard in my chest, but it did not soften. "You chose money over me, father. You turned your back on your only child and on everything mother built. There are some wounds that apologies cannot heal." I pulled my hands away, feeling a strange peace settle in my bones. "You are no longer welcome here."
He sobbed quietly, shoulders shaking, but I stood my ground.
Eventually, he left, his footsteps echoing down the hall, fading into the shadows. I watched him go, not with hate, but with the certainty that justice, true justice, had finally been served. In the months that followed, I turned my attention to rebuilding not just the house, but my life. I restored the gardens my mother had loved, replanted the rose bushes and magnolias, and filled the air with music and laughter. I opened Harcourt Hall's doors to those in need, hosting charity balls for local hospitals, creating scholarships in my mother's name for girls across South Carolina and New York, and funding art programs and women's shelters. I discovered a sense of purpose I never knew I possessed, a strength that came not from the billions in my bank accounts, but from the knowledge that I had survived the worst and risen from the ashes. Old friends, once kept away by my father's coldness, returned. I found new companions among the staff, the gardeners, and cooks who had known me since childhood. I traveled London in spring, Paris in autumn, seeing the world through my own eyes. Not as a Harcourt heiress, but as Amelia, a woman forged by betrayal and loss and ultimately by love. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I would walk the halls of Harcourt Hall and feel my mother's presence beside me, a gentle whisper in the rustle of the curtains, a laugh in the flicker of candlelight, a reminder that love is always stronger than greed. Justice had prevailed, but it was love that healed. My father never returned. Word reached me, months later, that he'd moved north, living quietly in a rented apartment under another name, too proud to accept any help. Isabel divorced him, leaving him truly alone. I mourned the loss of what might have been, but not what was. Standing on the porch one golden evening, the Atlantic wind singing through the old oaks, I realized I had finally found peace. My story was not just one of betrayal and revenge, but of redemption and strength, a story my mother would have been proud to tell. And above all, it was mine,